Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dani Rodrik. I'm the president of the International Economic Association, also one of the directors of the Economics for Inclusive Prosperity network. And this is the second of joint events we've organized on this broad topic of diversifying economics globally, making economics truly a global profession. We have a fantastic panel, and I don't want to take much time away from them, but I thought I would start with just a couple of slides to put our general topic into some kind of context and set the stage for what we'll hear from our panelists. The first thing I want to mention is the imbalance globally between, if I can move my slide, so I'm not able to move my slide right now. There we go. So this is a chart that shows the global distribution of publications in the very top journals, which is shown by the orange bars, and compared with the global distribution of economic activity or GDP. And what's interesting here is, I mean, it's not surprising that the richer countries, the US and Western Europe, have the bulk of the publications in the top journals. But what's interesting to me is how skewed the distribution of published articles in the top journals of the profession is, even when you take into account the economic activity differences in economic activity. So America and Western Europe are significantly overrepresented in the top journals. East Asia, even though its share has increased in recent years, is way below. And so is Latin America, but really where the biggest gaps you have in some senses in South Asia and Africa and the lowest income countries. If we disaggregate these numbers, according to sort of the type of journal and I don't know why. Oh, there we go. By the type of journals, as well as sort of take a kind of a crude look over time, and disaggregating the world by the US, other developed countries, and the rest of the world. And then we look across sort of journals sort of roughly ranked by the number of citations, or if you will, the quality of the journals, how much citations do you get by different categories. What strikes to me here is really two things. One is that at the very top, the most selective journals, that the share of the rest of the world really has not changed much at all. There has been some rebalancing among the advanced countries, that in particular Europe has gained some ground if you look at the other columns. But the rest of the world, which is sort of mostly developing countries, essentially the share has not increased. Where the share of the rest of the world in developing countries has increased actually is in journals that are relatively less well ranked. So if you look at the other row, journals that are ranked actually below 100, there you actually see a significant increase in published articles from authors that are based in the rest of the world. So that sort of loosely tells me that there has been an increase in the supply of economic research, research production in the rest of the world, but it's not reflecting itself. It's not reflected in the top journals. And I think that's problematic, not just from the sense of providing access to the top journals for authors from the rest of the world, but it's also, I think, as I explained in a recent short piece, I think it makes economics, the discipline itself, poorer. because it shuts off, it raises barriers to different perspectives from the rest of the world. So with that as background, let me just now move to the panel. We're very happy to have 4 panelists. The first one is going to be Raquel Bernal from Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. Second, we'll hear from Haroon Bhorat from the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Third, Wendy Carlin from UCL in London, CEPR in the Santa Fe Institute. And fourth, Nagla Rizk from the American University of Cairo in Egypt. So with that, let me turn first to Raquel. I asked our panelists to say a few words at the beginning, sort of more from a kind of a personal perspective, more of an autobiographical perspective. That is, what has been your experience with established networks and the difficulties that you've encountered, the strategies you've used to overcome them, as clearly you have. What's been the importance of mentorship and other experiences you've acquired. So Raquel, the screen is yours.
Well, greetings to everybody. It is really a pleasure to be here and sharing this panel with these colleagues. Thank you, Dani, for your invitation. So I'm located in Bogota, Colombia. I work at the University of Los Andes here, Economics Department. I started my PhD at NYU a long while ago. I'd initially written the year, but I decided to erase that a long time ago. I was told early on not to work on Colombian data or Colombian issues if I wanted to do well in the job market. I was also told never to mention that I would eventually return to Colombia or want to return to Colombia for my PhD, presumably because that would make my life difficult in trying to find an advisor. Because it's important to be rewarded with a placement in the US. So that was the beginning of my career. I started as an assistant professor at Northwestern University. I was there for 4 years. And then I moved back to Colombia. Those years in the US really allowed me to meet people, build networks, meet co-authors, and I built friendships that have made it possible for me to continue an academic career with good publications, even if I'm not located in the North. In spite of this, my career is obviously different than the counterfactual. If I decided to stay in the US, I constantly have to make investments, efforts, and take strategic decisions so that I can keep being relevant, so that I can still be considered a serious academic, albeit being working at a university in the South. However, the academic career that I ended up with is different, but very rewarding in many ways that probably I wouldn't have been able to do in the North, in the US or in Europe. And I will tell you why. Dani mentions that the social sciences would benefit if confronted with unfamiliar environments, and I fully agree. However, I think it's not only about science, frontier, economics research, publications. It is also about the impact of our profession on economies, on societies, and on democracies. Our impact on development, on poverty, on sustainability. And this is where the developing world is critical for our impact. I've built a career here along with the government. Initially, I intended to bring my wisdom to the government. That obviously did not work. Later on, I realized that I needed to really work with them, understanding the problems, the constraints, the political incentives. And only then could any of my research have any real impact on how policies are designed and implemented. For example, there is a global agreement among academics and policymakers about the importance of early childhood investments. And however, in spite of that, implementation of effective early childhood policies is scarce worldwide. And it is not that we don't understand, it is probably something about not being able to implement it right, given the context, the political conditions, the incentives and constraints. So only being present could make a difference, in my opinion. So it is true that there is a clear publication bias in favor of the North. It is clear that the direction in which the profession goes is led by the North, but also we're losing significantly on potential impact of the profession globally. So this is an issue for us in the South, but also an issue for researchers in the North. Very important to interact both ways. Obviously, mentorship, having co-authors in the North and building networks have been critical, because I can publish, but I also think it has been very critical for my co-authors in the North to have that connection with the developing world, directly with governments, understanding critical issues, political economy, constraints that they face in order to be able to make this knowledge, this research action that can be translated into development, growth, equity. So I think, Dani, that the network and the relationship has to be both ways. And I think the profession as a whole would really benefit from that two-way channel of communication. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raquel. Can I ask those of you who are who are listening to to mute yourself? Maybe I will actually just do that. And so move on to Haroon.
Great, thanks, Dani. As Dani mentioned, he asked us to give sort of a personal reflection of the challenges we faced, advice for others, and mentorship, which, as you know, with economists, we find it really difficult to talk about personal matters, or at least I do, right? So I do like unscramble my brain because I couldn't find any data to present, right, for the session. So it was quite useful, because I realized that, as usual, South Africa is quite different, because if you recall, we had this thing called apartheid, right? We had this racist system. And so I come on stream in 1991, which is still during the apartheid years, as a master's student into an academia that's predominantly white. But the interesting thing, here's the good part of the story, is that, like most societies that have oppressive regimes, the progressive part of the society, the free thinkers, sit in academia. So in fact, it was a really useful vehicle for me to appreciate what the post-apartheid South Africa would be like. So I had a very welcoming set of, let's say, older academics who sort of understood how research worked and so on. And so entry into university positions was often where many current political leaders actually reside. Dani knows quite a few of them. You know, a lot of these political leaders in South Africa's history started out in academia. So we mixed a lot with those academics, and in many ways, the bridge was built, which links a little bit to Raquel's point about policy and research in a country context. So that bridge was built very early on during the apartheid years, and then maintained as these current academics became politicians in the new South Africa. And so ministers and senior officials in government used to be academics at our universities. And so that bridge was always built and ready to go, so to speak, post-94. So it struck me that the one thing that I did do in my career was, so very early on, was offered a tenured, what you would call a tenured position at the University of Cape Town. There's a little bit of difficulty in, so started my coursework at MIT, but then ran out of funding because the scholarship ended, and then had to come back with no degree. So there are lots of those stories which I think would be useful to share, of developing country scholars who actually don't have resources to continue their studying in graduate programs. Perhaps those gaps have been closed dramatically, but be that as it may, I then complete all the degrees locally and then get offered a tenured position at the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town, which is where I am, which is this beautiful building behind you. But this is what I quickly realized, and perhaps this is one of the obstacles I'd love to hear from other colleagues on this call, is, and perhaps it's a little bit controversial, is that I realized that research and teaching were not complements, that actually they were substitutes. And in many ways, what happened to me in my first 3 years as a young academic at the University of Cape Town was that I was swamped with undergraduate, mainly first year teaching. That's all I did. I did huge classes day in, day out, and I found myself exhausted and had no time to actually do any research. So what I did actually then was to switch out of teaching. I gave up the tenured position and moved into a part-time contractual position at a research institute. And that's the research institute behind me, the logo. So I run that research institute now, but I entered it as a part-time outsourced employee. I gave up the permanent position so that I could do full-time research. And so that's one of the things I think that's worth discussing, is how do you, at the early stage career of developing country researchers, I'm not sure exactly how it would operate in other universities, but I'd like that as a point of discussion, is how do you build that combination of research and teaching for young scholars? Because ultimately, if your CV says I did, 5 years of undergraduate teaching and I have 0 publications, that's meaningless compared to somebody who did 1 hour of teaching but has 5 top 20 journal articles, right? So the real currency for, let's call it mobility as a researcher or standing as an academic, is publications. And how do you unlock that for young researchers, for me, is a really interesting question, and it's one of the massive obstacles I faced. In the remaining time, maybe just a little bit about vehicles for that change. Again, post-apartheid South Africa, we suddenly were a society that existed on the planet. So you could not travel, some of you are old enough to remember this, you could not travel to 90% of the globe on a South African passport. But you were, more importantly for us in the region, is we couldn't access any countries legally north of South Africa, right? But with post-94 changes, the African Economic Research Consortium was then an opportunity for young researchers like myself on the continent to actually get involved in its big multi-country research projects. And so the flagship project that they ran then under Eric Thorbeck of the FGT, the T in FGT fame, was on poverty and inequality trends in sub-Saharan Africa. And so a group of South Africans, there were 4 or 5 of us, were the first to think carefully using micro data sets and applying that to poverty and inequality, or provide an analysis of poverty and inequality trends in South Africa. The key thing for me there is you had an institution that was supporting groups of researchers, but they were very clear on 2 things. They wanted young researchers, and being South Africa, they insisted on researchers of color, so Black researchers. And it seems to me that that worked really well, and they kept a tight rein on co-authorship and so on. Final point is, and maybe that's for discussion later, is I realized very quickly that in order to think creatively, you did need strong, it's Raquel's point, strong international networks and international collaborative ventures. And not only because of the cross-pollination of ideas, but also because immeasurably the quality of the work you produce is much, much higher the more international scholars that you get involved in. And so over the years, we, in various ways, got involved with scholars at Cornell University and elsewhere. So for me, that was also a really important sort of latter part of my journey, which is moving from trying to get out of teaching into research. And then once you've sort of started publishing locally, figuring out a way further up the chain, let's call it, to international publications and the role of institutions and international scholars. Let me stop there, Dani. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Haroon. Wendy?
Yeah, okay. So my route into economics was somehow unusual. I came in through a completely sort of experimental interdisciplinary program at the first year of a new university in Perth, Western Australia. So this is high income, but it's like most isolated city in the world. I then decided to do economics because I figured out I needed to do that to understand how the world works. But I became an economist outside any well-integrated networks. And I think Australia is interesting. It doesn't, of course, even figure on the charts that Dani presented. So, you know, it raises this issue of sort of geographical dislocation. And it has a long tradition of important contributions. So they came, and this speaks a little bit to both Haroon and Raquel's contributions. So in Australia, it was a numerically very small community of economists, and mainly in the eastern states, very far from Perth. And it was based on a very close interplay between the special features of a small, open, high-income economy and the policy problems that it faced. So the economists were kind of stuck there geographically, and they were embedded in the policy problems of the moment. So just to give an example, Trevor Swan, who people may not have heard of, but they may have, he was concerned about the implications for living standards of the high allocation of capital to housing that would be implied by the big immigration to Australia in the 1950s. So what he did, he was very concerned about this policy problem, but what he did was to develop the neoclassical growth model independently of Solo in the same year, in 1956. It's still called the Solo-Swan model by some people. You'll see it in Aghion Howitt's book, for example. And Solo actually makes a lot of reference to it when he talks about the origins of the Solo model. So it's really interesting that, you know, you can have these pockets of excellence emerging with this interplay between the academy and the problems that economy faced. So its origins were really different from how Solo got to the Solo growth model. And there are other examples as well. So some people have heard of Salter. Salter was very big on embodied technology models of growth, and also the famous Salter-Swan model for understanding international policy dilemmas. These people did not publish outside Australia. So Swan didn't publish anything outside Australia. And there's a huge amount of research in this journal called The Economic Record that only Australians or some international economists, I can see Dani nodding, look at. And people like Bob Gregory published there's a lot of stuff on resource-rich economies. So I guess what I'm really trying to say is that this is a problem that doesn't just concern levels of resources or income. There really is a geographical component to all of this. And Dani said in his thing, access to networks is key to the generation and diffusion of knowledge. And both Raquel and Haroon have mentioned this. And this is just so obviously true. I mean, I was catapulted out of this little isolated place I got a Rhodes Scholarship, and then suddenly I was in Oxford, and it was pretty straightforward to be connected to networks. My connection occurred through co-authorship. Those co-authors connected me to two very distinct but very useful Anglo-American research networks. Then it's the link to the CEPR, showing how a very well-organized network that really pushed up European research publications into prominence in the big journals. So that's how it happened for me. Once you get into there, you then get invited to, NBER conferences. You then get into the kind of more US kind of circuit and so on and so on. So I benefited, but the geographic periphery didn't. So I've spent all my working life in the UK. I've done much more research on Germany than any other country, certainly nothing on Australia. So the issue that Dani raises of the importance of local knowledge and insight, how do we bring that properly into the mainstream? And I guess the way I'm trying to do it, since I've utterly failed in this other dimension, is through the core project. And this, touches on what Haroon said as well about this connection between research and teaching. And what we're trying to do, and ever since we started this project of transforming the way economics is taught, is to broaden the intro course by bringing local knowledge and insight from around the world. We've definitely succeeded better in some topics than in others. We're just about completing a South Asian version of the economy led by Arjun Jayadev and his team at Azam Premji in Bangalore. And some of the insights from this will then be pulled through into the flagship, the Economy 2.0, which we're planning. So we do have authors all around the world, but not enough. And the ones we have mainly because of northern network connections. So, that's the way the world works. But I do think this is a way of getting this two-way flow of benefits. And I hope overcoming this view that teaching and research are competitive and not complementary. So the idea is to, bring in researchers' insights from a much more diverse global community, get them into the classroom, and get the teachers and the researchers seeing themselves as in one community. So those researchers, getting Haroon back into the first year classroom is my objective, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Wendy. Final panelist is Nagla Rizk.
Thank you very much, Dani. Thank you for initiating this panel. My experience, I grew up in Egypt. I studied at the American University in Cairo, which is an American institution that is part of the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. That's important because we follow the American system of promotion and tenure and hiring and all the North, sort of the global North standards, yet we are based in Cairo with all the challenges that happens. Now, as I received my BA and MA there, and during that time, I worked also for Canada's International Development Research Center. I was a very young researcher. And what I was looking at development priorities in the Middle East and North Africa and how we could advise the head office on areas of funding research. So I was very interested in the role of research in improving the livelihood of people, pure development economics, evidence-based, and also assessing the projects that were there. Then I got the opportunity to study for my PhD at McMaster University in Canada. I was very excited to pursue my interest, to learn more and use the tools and get more evidence from other parts of the Global South. I was surprised, and I have to say unpleasantly surprised, that the curriculum was all mostly mathematical, theoretical, hardly any evidence, and if there were evidence, empirical work, it was not on the Global South. So I finished my PhD. Not only that, but also the theoretical work was seen as higher status than empirical work. Now, this was happening in the late 80s, but to my happiness and relief, there was an article published in the Journal of Economic Literature, 1991, with a report of the Commission on Graduate Education in Economics by Anne Kruger, reporting on a commission that was included top-notch economists chaired by Kenneth Arrow, members including Joe Stiglitz, Alan Blinder, Lucas, Schultz, Summers, Blanchard and others. And they were actually, this commission was created by the head of the then head of the American Economic Association, Robert Eisner, to look into this issue. So here I am reading a JEL article that talks about my own impressions. And actually the article was discussing the report, how economics is being divorced from real world problems, the preoccupation with formal techniques, and creating successive generations of economists become more skilled at math, each demands more of the next. So to quote the article, we might teach the language of mathematics, but not the logic of economics, and end up valuing the grammar of the discipline rather than its substance. That's page 1041 of the article. Having said, I mean, this sort of validates my concern. I finished my PhD, fast forward years later, I'm hired by the American University in Cairo as full-time faculty, and I faced, I'm to run for promotion and tenure. I remind you that this is, we follow, I say that because I'm chair of the promotion and tenure committee in my department. We follow the standards. We have, external reviewers from the global north. We have a very, strict system. And this happens at a time against local challenges. We have very limited resources. We have a heavy teaching load, I feel, Haroon, as well. We are also asked to do service, which is another, occupies a good part of our time. There is a dearth of data living in Cairo, and we are constantly, looking of ways to fund research. So the challenge there of publishing in top journals, I thank Dani for bringing out, I don't need to emphasize the point, he told us about how the ecosystem of the academic journals is global north centric. The editorial boards, the publishers, the institutions, associations, the subject matter, the authors, even the language. So this severe imbalance has three negative consequences. One, Dani has very well told us about the discipline itself. It becomes incomplete. You have an incomplete global picture. But perhaps more seriously for universities, because these feed into the ranking, the global ranking of universities. So if publishing in top academic journals is one metric, one component of the metric of ranking of universities, not surprisingly, universities of the global south always come at the bottom of the scale. So it feeds into the inequality. But also for economists like myself, remember, I'm interested in policy impact, in bringing a change in development economics. And this is not an area of interest for the top journals. And again, like Raquel, I mean, on Egypt, on details of the economy of Egypt and policy impact of Egypt, that is not a priority for top-notch journals. So that's a tension that actually takes from us in researchers who want, economists who want to impact their communities and policy impact as well. So I did three things. I reached out. I mean, I used to attend the AEA regularly, meetings for hiring and for also inspiration. And I used to present within the Middle East Economic Association. And this is how I was fortunate enough to meet and get to know Joe Stiglitz. And eventually, I mean, years later, he was my guest speaker, which I'm very proud of. The second thing, I expanded, frankly, my interest beyond economics to include other disciplines, mostly law. I work mostly with law schools on the economics of intellectual property, for example, on the economics of innovation. And because, in my opinion, the real world is multidisciplinary, I was much more comfortable working multidisciplinary research. I founded a research center at my university at the School of Business called Access to Knowledge for Development, which is the center that hosted Joe Stiglitz in January 2011. And within that, I have, we are part of a lot of plenty of international networks that are multidisciplinary. And our role is to present the voice of the South. I'm also very proud to be part of the Open African Innovation Research Network, which precisely does this. We work on evidence-based research to bring grounded theory. So the field, we do not want to think the theory comes from the north and evidence is from, empirical research is in the south. We come up with our own theories that are grounded in our own contexts and are there for, to learn together with the global north. And we have plenty of work in the Middle East and North Africa. I diversified my teaching. And again, I go back to Haroon's point. Eventually, my university was very supportive. I teach digital economy. I teach economics of intellectual property. I actually teach a Harvard Law School course, Copyright X. I taught at Yale Law School. I taught at School of International and Public Affairs in Columbia. It was liberating, I have to say and confess. And when I could afford it, I decided to prioritize policy impact in Egypt and the Arab world, actually. So we have success stories of research for the software strategy for software industry in Egypt. I now sit on the technical committee for the AI strategy for Egypt, the National Council, and we work with national entities on innovation assessment, grounds up innovation again. So, you know, I've had fantastic mentors. I remember fondly my professor Adel Bishay, who taught me the philosophy of economics, that it is beyond numbers. There is a philosophy in economic thinking. Again, I had my great supervisor in Canada who sort of gave me faith in my work on evidence-based research in my thesis, Atif Qobrosi, and of course, Joe Stiglitz, who's an inspiration in relevant economics, in meaningful economics, and telling us that we can actually look at a holistic approach to the issues that we study. I will stop there and thank you very much.
Thank you, Nagla. I think we've had a really fascinating set of comments. There's so much to reflect on and chew up on. I don't know where to start, but maybe I'll start from this comment that Wendy made about the early contributions of some key Australian economists, Trevor Swan in particular, and how that work actually became part of the mainstream. It was adopted, and it's my students still use the Swan-Salter diagram. I think it's a fundamental way to understand open macroeconomic policy in the open economy. And as I was thinking about the Australian example, I thought that maybe, so one question is why, how did it actually become possible? I don't know, whether Wendy was putting a positive or negative spin on this story. Maybe Trevor Swan's work should have been celebrated much more than it has been, but clearly he's known, he's remembered, and the work became mainstream, became, sort of at the core of the discipline. And in that sense, it's a kind of a success that there's a somewhat peripheral economy from the, wealthy, but still peripheral economy in terms of research networks produced economic work that became core, even though Trevor Swan was still based in Australia. Then I thought that maybe this was not so unusual in an earlier period. I mean, there was a period when in the 1970s, late 60s, 70s, economists based in India made significant contributions to international trade theory, to central planning, to planning models, and so forth, that were well received and became part. Many of those people, like T.N. Srinivasan and Jagdish Bhagwat, eventually moved to the United States, but I think their work became part of the mainstream and became recognized while they were still doing that work in India. Maybe a little bit later, I think of Latin American contributions to economics. Of course, Latin America has been famous for its macroeconomic imbalances and populism, and so I think a lot of that work on hyperinflation, sort of fiscal policy, monetary policy that came out of Latin America in the 70s, 80s also became sort of mainstream. I find it difficult to believe that the same is actually still possible today. That in some ways the economics discipline, it seems to me, has become much more insular within itself. So it's become in that way sort of significantly less globalized, in that it listens a lot less to contributions that are coming out of researchers based in the rest of the world. It has become, I think, more globalized in another dimension, which is that now, I think if you went to a top 15, top 20 department in the United States, or for that matter in Europe, you'll find a lot more academics who were born and grew up in the rest of the world. So they've opened up in that way. So if you're actually, managed to make it to Europe and the United States, then it's actually, I don't know what the top departments in the US would be without talent from the rest of the world. So that's, in that way, it's sort of globalized, but but if you're not based in North America or in Europe, you might very well remain peripheral. So the question then becomes, I mean, obviously, northern networks, northern universities are hugely benefiting from this migration of talent, and are they really doing enough to look out for sort of research institutions and universities and researchers who are doing valuable work, even though they're not in the developed countries? And if they're not doing enough, and my suspicion is we'll agree they're not doing enough, what is it that they can do? So Haroon mentioned some of the regional networks. The ERC can play a very important role. There's the ERF for the Middle East. There's LACEA in Latin America. I think these all have been very successful models of promoting work among economists in those regions. But are there things that networks like the NBER or the CEPR or major national economic associations like the Royal Economic Society, European Economic Association, American Economic Association, or the top universities really should do to open up their networks to researchers that are actually based in developing countries? Any thoughts on what those sort of networks based or academic institutions, research institutions based in the North ought to be doing? Anybody want to comment on this?
Well, I think it should be the same process that we're all going through in relation to women and other underrepresented groups, and that is to get people in the pool. So, for example, organizing committees for conferences, editorial boards should have a mandate that requires them to make some specific kinds of efforts to get researchers located outside the top universities on the program. So, because I think it's for some institutions where that has happened for women. I know it happened, for example, in the CEPR when they were trying to deal with the problem of very unbalanced fellows. It was all a business about just getting it on the table and getting that pool expanded, making people look where they weren't looking before. So that would be, one sort of concrete kind of, commitment that could be taken by journal editors and conference organizers.
Dani, one additional comment on that. I think the networks are really important, associations, conferences, workshops, but I think it would be very useful to have fellowships for short-term visits or long-term visits. I think conferences have a certain objective, but not necessarily creating that connectedness that's more long-lasting in a way, right? And Haroon, I think, was mentioning funding. So obviously funding in the South, it's complicated for research, for traveling, for achieving that connectedness. So perhaps it is important to guarantee some funding for that, for these visits. From the South to the North, but I insist that it would also be very important to do the opposite, to bring these great thinkers to the South, to inspire, to get acquainted to the developing world's issues for capacity building. Why not? I mean, it is true that capacity is restricted in the global South, and this is an issue that we face, and to strengthen the profession globally. So this connectedness both ways, I think it's really important, and funding is an issue. Here, Haroon was talking about the difficulty in doing research. Well, it's not easy to find public or private funding in the South. We struggle. So that has obviously an impact on the quality of the research that we do. And trying to guarantee access to sources in the North would be really very valuable, which is difficult. So in my case, what I've done is these networks, networks with co-authors that allow me to get funding in the North. Otherwise, it would be extremely difficult to move forward some of the research here without funding in these countries. So I think funding and connectedness are significant issues for the Global South.
Can I
could come in?
Oh.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Nagla, you're next.
Yes, thank you. I just, I was thinking about this, and I think what I'm thinking, it's a question of changing the mindset, of having a will to change the paradigm. So I listened to Wendy, really very happily, because I was thinking of promoting good faith affirmative action in publishing, honestly. In editorial boards, more room for scholarship from the South, both empirical work and grounded theory. We should not limit ourselves, as I mentioned earlier, that the South is for empirical work only, but also support open access versions of current journals. So when I think of access, it's access to researchers to publish their work, but also to read and be able, not everybody has the resource to be, on JSTOR or has the ability to have access to these journals. So how can there be support for free and open access versions of these journals, of the top journals? Now, the open access journals, again, is another issue. How do you address quality in open access journals? That's another story. But if journals that are already there and we know the quality, why can they not be available for less wealthy users and readers? And also supporting the translation, because in the end, they're all in English. So that's another layer, and a hopeful layer of supporting translation. But I also do not want to overlook the university rankings paradigm, the mindset, the way universities are ranked, the idea of changing the mindset of academic excellence. What is academic excellence? Why can we not include policy impact on communities, impact on development, and not only publishing in top tier journals? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Could I come in? This is Ibrahim Al-Badawi.
Yes, Ibrahim, I was going to turn to you next. Go ahead, Ibrahim.
From the Economic Research Forum. I think, Dani, you asked an important question about the role of regional networks. And I would like to suggest that the Economic Research Forum, now in business for more than 25 years, I think have made considerable contribution to retaining indigenous capacity, as well as enhancing indigenous capacity in the Middle East and North Africa region through various modalities, most notably, of course, funding, but even more importantly, building a framework for training and capacity building for young researchers through open competitive research, which I think has become an important instrument for the ARF over the years, and also building some sort of social and academic cohesion across the region. Now, increasingly, we find researchers coming together, putting proposals drawn from various universities and different countries, which is very important for cross-fertilization, bringing diverse experiences, especially since we do have some sort of kind of diversion in terms of the academic standard. We have Turkey, for example, and Tunisia and Egypt are three top countries in terms of the number of researchers, as well in terms of the quality of research. And we have been trying to bridge the gap across countries and ensure that we emphasize more capacity building in countries and sub-regions that are not considered relatively less advanced. And that's one dimension in terms of the capacity building. The other dimension really is in terms of the data. The ARF is really a model for building micro data and harmonizing this data and making it available to researchers, especially on the labor market and household type issues and more recently, in terms of the firm level data, we have relationship with about 21 national statistics bureaus and centers in the region, and we have agreements with them to make their data available to the researchers. And I think that's another important aspects that provide opportunities for researchers. The other modality is what we call high-end research through special projects that involves well-established researchers from the region and outside the region. And then, of course, the annual conference, which is really the flagship event for the network, where we do address topical issues and try to invite top scholars in the topic in question. For example, the forthcoming event will be on the rethinking macroeconomic policy or macroeconomics in the wake of COVID-19 and beyond, addressing issues related to the impact of these kind of shocks in thinking about macroeconomics. But we have been doing lots of such kind of activities, not only through the annual conference, but in the context of various research projects that we do. Is at the end of each research project, we organize an event. And I think finally, let me say that more recently, we have been doing something that I am really excited about, which is collaborating with the AARC to actually address continental issues, such as, for example, the Maghreb, Francophone Africa, economic geography and value chains, regional value chains, and so on. And then we want eventually to study issues that are source of tension and conflict, such as the Nile Basin issues related to the potential benefits, but the existing conflicts among the Nile riparian countries and these kind of things. So I think the regional networks have really made considerable contribution, though I should say that this contribution is to some extent lopsided because of the nature of the funding. The emerging style of funding is tied funding on issues that are likely to be micro-oriented.
Ibrahim,
so it has been to some extent.
We need to move. Yeah, we're running out of time. So
yeah, so this is basically what I wanted to say. Thank you.
No, I mean, I think that's great, because I as the panelists have mentioned, I think the contribution of regional networks like ERF and their equivalents elsewhere in other regions really has made a difference, I think, for local researchers. Maybe I'll just take one more question or comment from the audience before I turn back to the panel with another broad sort of question. So, but Keun Lee, if you can make your point, Aras, rather quickly.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank you, IEA, for organizing this session. I've been to Ibrahim's conference, ERF, held in Egypt some years ago. I found this really exciting, successful event in economics. So I think one way to diversify our economics is to promote more such regional activities and events. And people like Dani or Wendy and Joe, if you guys come to more open such conferences, that's one way to boost up those local initiatives. I think it's a better way than to trying to publish in top journals in American top journal. We better promote different alternative journals and local initiatives, and that might be another constructive way to promote diversity in the economics field, I think.
Thank you, Keun. So maybe I'll just ask the panelists for I promised them that I wouldn't keep them for more than an hour, so I want to turn to them for a final set of quick reflections. But maybe to sort of as reflections on this particular question. I mean, the issue here has both a kind of a resource dimension and another dimension which doesn't have to do with resources, is mostly about sort of how networks behave and the inward looking. And we've discussed a little bit about what can, what established networks can do to expand, and that's been very useful. But if we turn to the resource question, the question I'm wondering is, if we had, sort of resources, imagine that we had a lot of money. One can imagine spending it on building capacity in institutions, in universities, academia in the developing world. For example, sort of course relief and building research networks and infrastructure in the developing world. So doing, spending it on the developing world. Or we can imagine spending it on fellowships and postdocs for researchers in the developing world to actually come and visit and spend time in the advanced world. So, actually basically, we would be financing their ability to access those networks through postdocs, visiting researcher positions, attend conferences in the North. In other words, do we spend the money on the North, or do we spend it on the South? And how do we think about sort of those priorities? So with that, maybe I'll do the final in a kind of reverse order. Nagla, you want to start us off? Again, bearing in mind that this is going to be our last quick set of reflections.
Thank you, Dani. I think it's just integrated efforts, not just one effort to build on already existing networks. We all have our networks. These are already there. So just supporting networks of collaboration between the different institutions with an eye, as I mentioned before, to making journal publications more inclusive. I think this will open the door to plenty of fantastic scholarship that is coming from the South that will find its way to the readership and to use by various economists around the world. I think this is my academic journals, affirmative action, opening up for the South, and certainly capitalizing on already existing networks of research. Thank you.
Thank you, Nagla. Wendy?
Yeah, I don't really have much more to add. I think this is a case of virtuous circles, and in some sense, it doesn't really matter where the injection occurs, because if you build capacity in the South, then people will come and so it's just be very concrete. So suppose we build on the kind of work that then Wanchicon is doing in Africa, and we have these summer schools, but we do this in a more sort of systematic way, and we put those that capacity building together with a kind of explicit focus on network connections, both on the research and my view as well, integrated with the teaching side, then we get the flow going in both directions. So I think we kind of know what to do, but you're probably asking for what we should do first. Yeah, so I don't think it really matters where we start. I think if we get the momentum going, then this really can be a virtuous circle process.
Thank you, Wendy. Haroon?
Yeah, so I think the resource envelope question is a really great one, but I think it may be useful to almost break up the problem just very briefly. I mean, if you think of it at one level, you've got the research capacity issue. So that's, whether it's training on Stata and R and their whole range of these, it's instruments for capacity building of Southern researchers or researchers in developing countries that PEP and others do really well, but you could ramp that up and you could be more deliberate. CGE modeling, right? So I think there's that, but then there's, up the research value chain, so to speak, there's not enough support, I don't think, given to developing country researchers on how to submit a journal article, right? Which journals to choose, how to pivot a 100-page working paper into a 20-page journal article with the angle that the journal editor or the journal would find useful given the literature. There's none of that training that ever happens, right? Or hand-holding. That's really useful. But you sort of find this out by osmosis, right? But it does need deliberate resources attached to it. Maybe developed country researchers working with developing country researchers on a topic of common interest to actually handhold them. Then for me, there's the final one, Dani, which is, for me, there's the developing country researchers in northern universities that are getting into top journals, and that's fine because it's an institutional link. The difficult one for me, which I can't, so I understand if on method, and it's a little bit of a gripe session. So on method and approach, you're not up there with the literature, and so your top 20 journals reject. The difficulty is when everything's fine in terms of method, approach, you're right at the cutting edge of literature, but your country of choice is the problem. And I don't know how you get around that, right? I mean, it's just because it's a great paper, but it's on Bulgaria or on South Africa, or, so we're not really, and for me, that's the hardest one to fix, right? It's not clear that any resources will change that. But I just want to highlight that, right? So final point, a data point from researchers here at UCT, the University of Cape Town, they've done some work. They're showing even, Dani, if you look at development economics journals, the majority of authors are from developed country universities. So even within field, there's a massive bias. And again, I like the point from Nagla, what is she called it, soft affirmative action. I'm not sure how one thinks about that, but I think we have to open that discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Haroon. Raquel, you have the final word.
Dani, I think it is important to leave capacity in the South and build it in a way. If we continue to remove it in favor of the North, that this will never change. So it is very important to leave capacity in the South and continue to build it, and bring interest from the North to the South. I also liked Nagla's idea about impact mattering for academic excellence. I think this is a key issue, not only for the topic of this meeting, but for the profession as a whole. I think it would be extremely, extremely important. Just as an example, most of you probably know JPL, that their work aims at impact on public policy, alleviating real problems in the developing world. And most of the affiliates are located in developed countries. So in the recent list, there's 3 out of 38 that are located in the global South. So it's, it reveals this issue of not enough capacity in the South. So you ask about where to spend. I think obviously we need money for everything, but I think it's very important to spend in the South and to create that capacity so that people do not keep moving to the North, because we bring them to visit to the North and then they stay. So we need to find ways in which that investment creates the capacity, stays, and that links the North and the South eventually. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's a great note on which to end. I want to thank our panelists. It's been very stimulating and enlightening discussion, I think. This is the second, as I said at the outset of these conversations. The earlier one is the recording of which is already on the International Economic Association website. You can go there and find out what else we're doing in this area, but we certainly are going to continue this conversation, and as the IEA try to move forward on some of these ideas. So thanks again to panelists and the audience, and watch the space. Bye.
Thank you, Dani. Thank you, everyone.